I'm imagining that there's a lot of parents here who are uh, unfamiliar with or have received psych reports, things like that, don't totally know what to do with them. Quality, I think, varies pretty dramatically between uh, psych reports or reports in general. And then just kind of trying to figure out um, how do I make sense of this? How can this be useful? How do I know if this was done well? How do I know if I need a second opinion? So we're going to talk about all of that. I've got a pretty short kind of overview, and then mostly I would love to be answering questions, things like that. So yeah, a little bit about me. I'm an educational psychologist. I'm a licensed educational psychologist. I'm a school psych. I've been with a number of different districts in kind of this area. I grew up in Marin, so I've worked in Vallejo and Novato and Albany, and right now I work at a Mandarin immersion charter school in Oakland. And so I've been both on the district side of the table and also as a parent advocate and the person who's done independent educational evaluations. I'm also a professor at Cal State East Bay, but also St. Mary's in their school psych department. I teach their neuropsych assessment class. So this kind of stuff is my jam. This is my favorite thing. And I tend to, in my various schools and districts that I've been in, I tend to specialize in the either really litigious or very complicated cases are usually the ones that I end up getting asked to take. Um, so let's get started. So what's a psychoeducational report for? I think I have had a lot of experience with admin and various people who will be like, oh, they need a psych report, or oh, well, let's just do a report. And there are some really specific reasons that you would do a report, and it's not for every situation, right? I kind of try to remind, especially administrators and things like that, that a good quality defensible psych report is probably 25 to 40 hours of work, depending on the level of complexity of the case, right? So it's not a nothing, let's just assess sort of thing, right? Um, so the reasons that you would do a psych report are to determine eligibility for special education, and they support establishing present levels, right? Those are the primary two reasons, right? So psychoeducational assessment done through a school is not going to come up with a diagnosis. We're not typically credentialed to diagnose. Psychoeducational assessments are not very dissimilar from a diagnostic report, but because a school psych doesn't necessarily have an independent licensure, they are not diagnoses don't come from schools. Those come from like your medical professional or outside. So really, it's just determining eligibility and establishing present levels. Usually that means we tend to get a pretty good idea of what is going on for a kid and why, but not always, right? So sometimes you can say like, yes, a kid definitely qualifies. I don't totally know why or what is going on entirely. That's often pretty rare, but it does happen because the actual only question we have to answer in a psych report is, do they meet special education eligibility? The biggest thing to know about your reading a psych report is that it is unfortunately all statistics. Like, and I am so like it is a great irony of my life that I really hated math, and I was like not was like so excited to not have to do anymore in college. And then, as it turns out, every single aspect or every single day in my job, there's not probably an hour that goes by that I don't have to think about or work with some kind of statistical something. So that is sort of the grand irony of my professional life is that it turns out math is in everything that I do. And so in general, what we're looking at is there's a one thing that I think is really important for parents to know is that there's a really big difference between percentiles and percentages, right? A percentage is, a component of the whole. A percentile is, if you were to line up, 100 kids in order of how well they did on this exact thing, which number would your kid be, right? So better than, 50% of the kids or at the 50th percentile mark, right? And so sometimes what you'll see are things in reports where it's like, oh, they're at the, 26th percentile. And I've definitely had parents get really alarmed by that and go, oh my gosh, that is so low. I don't want my kid to only have, to be, missing 75% of this. And that's not what it's saying. It's saying that, that kid is well within the average range. So typically your average statistical, you're looking at standard scores that are between 85 and 115. You're anywhere in there. You don't have to be real concerned. Percentiles between 16 and 84, pretty average. Anything between 25th to 75th percentile is something I would not at all be concerned about. So just to have a little bit of an awareness of what some of those numbers are looking at. Special education is typically concerned with the lowest, probably 2 to 8% of the population. These are usually kids who are not progressing from grade level to grade level without pretty significant intervention. And so we're really looking for educational impact pretty much in that well below to below average range, right? Where we're really looking at the left side of the bell curve. And there's a big difference between what a parent is going to want for their kid and what somebody who, or even a classroom teacher, what they're going to want for their kid, which is for that kid to achieve their maximum potential versus what special education's mandate is, which is to allow a child to sort of achieve kind of average potential, right? So there are definitely kids who are maybe not achieving their maximum potential, but they're still falling within the average range. And that's not something that special education would become involved in, because that's not typically what those services are geared for and what they're not good at. They're not good at doing that part and can often be really harmful for a kid who's already kind of at or near grade level. Okay, how to read a psych report. This is my if you only have 15 minutes and you don't understand, and you psych reports are not your jam, you're not a giant stats nerd or a data nerd like me, or frankly, you haven't had a master's degree in it, because honestly, I don't totally understand how we expect parents and teachers and people who don't have degrees in this to fully understand, because it's so jargony, it's so complicated, and we in the profession don't always do a great job of explaining what's going on. I often will kind of explain to families or people in meetings that usually the psych report, the written part, usually that's written for lawyers and the next school psych or the next person. The presentation in the meeting, that's usually more geared for teachers and parents and in a way that can understand. Ideally, there wouldn't be a tremendous difference between those two, but that really depends on the skill of the assessor and the report writing skill. But reports have to be written in a really particular way because they are a legal document and they have to meet certain legal standards and requirements. So when you're going through a psych report, I actually don't tend to read the whole thing front to back. I find it overwhelming. And I also don't think that it gives me the most useful picture of what's going on. So first thing I want to do is I look at the referral reason. Why are we doing the assessment, right? What is the concern? And what eligibilities are we looking at? Because I want to make sure that I have an understanding of why we've decided that an assessment is appropriate, and what we're looking at. And I want to make sure that if I'm the parent, if I'm, a parent advocate, I want to make sure that referral reason is accurate, right? Because I want to make sure that it covers all of the things that we're concerned about. Because if it doesn't, then that's a good indication for me in some of the future slides that we'll talk about that perhaps this wasn't a report that looked at everything that we should be concerned about. So I start there. Then I skip down to the summary and conclusion, which is where they're going to summarize, kind of the big beats of all of the stuff that they did testing for and interviews for and kind of summarizing the big points of their argument. And then I go back and I look through scores. And I don't tend to look at the explanation or the written part of what the scores were. I usually just look for the tables. Um, because the scores give me a clearer picture than someone's interpretation. Um, so I'm looking for anything abnormally high. I'm looking for anything abnormally low. I'm looking for anything that seems like within its own index, like, oh, we're looking at math skills. Most of them are really high. There's one that's really different from the others, right? So I'm looking for things that stand out, right? So something that's low, something that's high, things that don't seem like they match with the rest of the kind of chunk that they're in. And then I'm just sort of noting what those are. Um, then I go to the testing observation, because sometimes some of those weird scores were like, oh, a lot of their math scores were totally average. There was one that was really low. Um, Sometimes that's not because of a kid's difficulty in that area. Sometimes it's like, oh, it was right before lunch and they really didn't want to do the test. And so they just kind of phoned it in. And so that's the score, but it's not super accurate. Or like maybe there was a fire drill in the middle of that memory test or things like that. So I'm looking in that testing observation for anything that might give me an indication that the results aren't the most accurate representation of their skills and might be better explained by it was really loud next door, or they kept, mentioning that they were hungry, or, they, um, were really missing a class that they didn't want to miss, and so they weren't super engaged. Something that might give me an inkling that, oh, they might actually be able to do more, but for whatever reason, the environment or the context was not quite right for them. Um, And then I look at eligibility determination, and the exclusionary factors and what they thought about the exclusionary factors. And exclusionary factors are a required part of really any report. And exclusionary factors are basically when you're making an eligibility determination, you have to be able to say, yeah, I think this is related to a disability and not these other things, right? But if there are other legitimate reasons that a kid's performance or academic performance or school performance might be impacted, that aren't related to a disability, you have to kind of talk about that, right? Some really common exclusionary factors are, poor attendance, right? If that kid has missed, you know, upwards of 15 to 20% of their school year or time, it kind of makes sense that they might be struggling academically. That's not necessarily a disability. It might be because they didn't have, enough access to the learning material. Other things are, do they speak enough English, right? I get a lot of referrals in schools for this kid can't do anything. They're really struggling. And then I find out like, yeah, they like just got here. They only speak a little bit of English. Of course, they can't do algebra. Could you give them a second? And so we don't want to call kids disabled when there's a really legitimate other reason that might not be going well. Um, Things like if there have been like really inconsistent or like long-term substitute teachers for, a kid's entire second grade year, they didn't have a regular classroom teacher and a whole bunch of subs, then like, yeah, maybe some of the skills that they learned at that period of, in that year might be a little uneven. That might not be related to a disability. And so having exclusionary factors doesn't mean that a kid can't be eligible. Um, but it does mean that you do have to talk about those, about yes, they don't, they are an English language learner. And that doesn't totally explain the difficulty, right? Because we did some testing in Spanish, or um, yes, this kid has had poor attendance, but they came to school every day for 6 weeks, and we did intervention with them for 6 weeks, and they actually didn't make the progress that we expected them to make in that period of time. So attendance probably isn't helping, but it's probably not the whole reason, right? And so um, that is just something to consider. And then I look at the eligibility, determination is, how are we deciding if a child is eligible or not? All eligibility has two prongs. It's, do they meet one of the 13 eligibility criteria, 14 if you are age 5 or younger. Do they meet one of the 13 criteria, and do they require a specially designed program in order to access the general education curriculum, right? So there are a lot of kids who have an outside diagnosis of autism or ADHD, or even dyslexia, where they might meet the criteria, the first part of the criteria, but it's not impacting them educationally enough that they would meet that second prong of eligibility. And so typically, if a kid is at or near grade level without pretty significant intervention, they're not usually they don't usually meet that second prong of eligibility. Other things, I know we have a parent of some kindergarten kids in the room, or some parents, excuse me. Typically, it can be really difficult to qualify in kindergarten unless there's some pretty significant either behavior or cognitive impairment type things, just because the expectations that we have of kindergartners educationally is pretty low. So it's pretty hard to be able to demonstrate a significant impairment at that point because they're so young, and development is so uneven. And so it is not necessarily uncommon that a kid may be a little behind or having a little bit of a harder time in certain aspects. And so it can just be a lot harder to meet that threshold in kindergarten because they're so little. Not impossible, but just an additional area of difficulty. Kindergartners in speech services are usually much easier. You usually, in early intervention, you will often see kids who are more frequently qualified under speech than they are other areas, even though you can maybe tell that other areas are going to become a concern over time. And part of that is because the speech piece shows up a lot more clearly when they're younger, whereas something like cognitive delay or a specific learning disability or some of those other health impairment, attention, things like that, those can be developmentally typical for that uneven development. And so it can be difficult to know that young what might just be uneven development and what is actually a developmental delay. So that can be why those other eligibilities are often less likely for kids when they're young. Speech tends to be much clearer because you can see it. And it is, by that point, by kindergarten, speech delays or things like that are much less developmentally appropriate. It's a little bit like, it'd be very hard to diagnose like a 12-month-old or a 14-month-old with a speech delay, because some kids don't talk by then and some do, and it's hard to tell, and it's normal for some to not maybe be speaking a lot. But for one kid, it might actually be a delay, but it's very, very hard to tell at that age range, right? So that is sort of a similar thing, just much, much younger. So that's why speech tends to be the category that kids qualify when they're quite young, and then other eligibilities might get added over time. All right. Okay, how to know if an assessment is thorough enough. This is tough a little bit, and sometimes it just actually requires asking an outside person. Matrix is great at stuff like that. Any report that you get legally has to include observations in the relevant education setting. Usually this is a classroom observation. So if ever I see a report that only has a testing observation, then that is not a complete sufficient report. It might not ultimately result in an inappropriate eligibility call or inappropriate present levels, right? It might not ultimately impact the end result, but just right off the bat, that tells me, ooh, I need to look at this with a real fine-tooth comb. Usually, so observations in the relevant setting, if I'm looking at a kid for social emotional concerns, or they're, have a lot of behavior or peer conflict or things like that, I'm going to want to make sure that I'm observing in the area where that is most likely to happen, right? If they are doing great academically, but they get into tons of fights with their peers, and I only observe them in math, I'm not observing the educational impact, right? So I'd want to make sure that I'm observing at recess, at PE, where those things happen. All reports should include some current school functioning, grades, teacher feedback, progress monitoring, whatever those look like, because that is establishing that educational impact for that second prong of eligibility. And then all reports should include some kind of parent contribution, rating scales, feedback, or if those are not available, the documented attempt to get them. So sometimes I'm sure that's not true for anyone in this room, but there are definitely times where I will have reached out to a parent 6, 7, 8 times via phone, via email, via text message, all the things, and just haven't gotten anything back. And so that at that point, then I document in my report like that I've really tried to get parent feedback, because parent feedback is so important. In schools, we only see kids in one setting, and we're not the expert on your kid, on your individual kid. Parents are the expert on their individual kid. People in schools and professionals like myself tend to be more of the expert on kids your kid's age. So like, I'm not the expert on your kindergartner, but I might be the expert on kindergartners in general and what is a concern in that general age range. So we really need to it's really important to have both that individual parent feedback, because you do know your kid the best, and to be able to include that and marry those two expertise together. Reports with testing. So not all reports have testing. Sometimes you're going to get a file review. If you used to do this a lot when I worked high school, moderate to severely impaired population students, that kid is 16, they've had Down syndrome their whole life. They do not need another round of cognitive. They just surprise, they still qualify. Like, you don't need me to pull them for 4 hours of testing to tell you things that you already know, right? So sometimes reports won't include direct testing if eligibility can be established without. But any report with testing should include, and so this is any try and any initial, should include an eligibility statement, a vision and hearing screening, right? Because this is one of those exclusionary factors. We want to make sure that we're not saying, yes, this kid has dyslexia, when actually they might just need glasses. So vision and hearing screening, an observation, testing observation, testing validity statement. This one's usually one that gets kind of glossed over. It's usually in the how to read the testing results section. And it's basically just saying like, no, based on this kid's English skills, their attention, their behavior in testing, I think that these tests are a valid example of their skill set, right? And then relevant background information, educational history, any outside diagnoses, those sorts of things. So that those all should be included. I always get a little worried about tries or testing, assessment reports when I get the please see previous reports for background information, and then that's it. That makes me real nervous. So because even if it's a triennial, even if their background history has been very, very established, a triennial, 3 years have happened, right? So were they in a car accident in that period of time? Do they have a new diagnosis? Something new has happened in that 3 years time, right? And so, I always kind of want to make sure that we are updating, updating that information. Okay. Some requirements are really specific for each eligibility, in that if you haven't done these tests, there's actually no way you could conclusively meet or disprove the eligibility requirements, right? So for a specific learning disability, they didn't do cognitives or didn't establish over time that cognitives are stable. There's no way to make that call, right? So should be doing cognitives. You always need updated academics, and there should be some kind of processing assessment, right? And so those are part of the eligibility requirements. And so I know that if they only did cognitives and academics and they didn't do any processing testing, it is very, very difficult to conclusively say, nope, no SLD. For intellectual disability, the eligibility requirements include cognitives and an adaptive skills deficit. So that means adaptive rating scales from parents, teachers. For other health impairment, this is a huge category that can include any health impairment. Most often it comes up for attention for ADHD and mental health, anxiety, depression, things like that. But it could also include things like, diabetes or, other less common health impairments, right? So it's hard to say exactly what needs to be required in this particular area, but certainly you need cognitive skills, you need the academic impact, and often those relevant rating scales. So in the case for ADHD, it would be attention rating scales at home and school, and those types of things, right? To really show that impairment is impacting, is consistent, isn't just in one setting. If I get one teacher who says, yes, this kid has crazy inattention, but all three of this kid's other teachers say it's fine, that says to me less that that's an attention problem and more that that's a teacher classroom problem. And then I would want to do more observations in that classroom and be like, all right, is this an actual kid problem or is this an environment problem, right? So you're kind of always trying to tease that piece out. For autism, a diagnosis is not required. Medical diagnoses and eligibility are not the same thing. They can point us in the right direction, but not a requirement. So for autism, you're often looking at cognitives, you're looking at academics, and then those autism rating scales, or maybe in some cases they might do something more directly diagnostic, like the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. Or things like the CARS or some of those more direct testing that's going to show theory of mind or social skills impairments, or figurative language difficulties, things like that. If autism is being assessed, like that's the area of concern, that should almost always go along with a speech assessment as well. Not 100% of the time. I'm hesitant to say 100% of the time, but very, very frequently it should go along with a speech assessment, because the eligibility criteria for autism is an impairment in verbal or nonverbal language. And so that would inherently imply a speech concern. And then for an emotional disturbance, you may not always need cognitives for an emotional disturbance, but it should be a lot of rating scales from a lot of different people, a lot of observations, interviews, a real hefty background section, to really, really show that educational impact. Okay, so you've gotten to the place where you're like, ooh, I don't know that this was a great psych report. And you're thinking about an IEE, or somebody has suggested, oh, you should get an IEE. There are times when it's worth it, and there are times when it's totally not. So when requesting an IEE is worth it is if we go back and think about that, the point of a psychoeducational report is to determine eligibility and help establish present levels. So if we have an incomplete assessment, when it's worth it is when we have questions about either one of those two things. When we think that the assessment didn't fully assess in an area of suspected disability, or didn't thoroughly assess the area of concern, right? So they said, oh, we're looking at SLD, but they didn't look at some of these specific areas that were a concern, or they only assessed in OHI, even though you shared that you had concerns about your kids reading, right? Things like that. So if they either didn't fully assess a category entirely, enough to be sufficient, or they didn't look at an entire eligibility category that was identified as an area of concern. You don't have to assess in every single area. You need to assess in all areas of suspected disability. And so sometimes what will happen is after a child is determined to be not eligible under these certain categories. Someone will come back and be like, well, what about specific learning disability? Or what about these things? You didn't assess in these areas. And in those cases, it's often, well, because that wasn't an identified area of concern, because they are meeting grade level expectations, because there's no indication of these areas of concern. That's why we didn't look at that. So that doesn't necessarily mean that a report is incomplete. It just means that that actually wasn't an area of suspected concern. And so from a parent standpoint, you want to make sure that you are making really clear and in writing, when possible, all of the things that you are worried about, right? Because if you didn't tell them, hey, I'm also worried that my kid has anxiety, then they aren't going to know to assess that, and they're not going to know to consider that eligibility, right? So, and that's where that making sure that the referral reason includes everything is really accurate. That's also when you get the assessment plan back, that, hey, we're looking at assessing in these areas. If you have concerns about social emotional things and the social emotional box isn't checked, that's an email back to go, hey, this is also an area of suspected disability. I'm concerned about these things. So when it's an incomplete assessment, that can be when it's worth requesting an IEE. Or if you're not sure that present levels are real usefully identified, right? This might not require a full IEE. It could be, hey, can you, I agree with the eligibility and all those sorts of things. I'm a little bit worried about these certain areas, and I think we might need some goals in these areas. Can you get some baselines or check some of these skills? Or you may want to go a full IEE route, depending on your kind of confidence in the team. Present levels drive goals, goals drive services, services drive placement, right? So if you're having an issue with placement or services, you got to go back to the goals. And so, here, actually, this is the next. So when is an IEE a waste of time? There are a lot of times where an IEE request comes in, and or I have families come to me and be like, oh, we want you to do an IEE, and not to shoot myself financially in the foot, but I will look at it and be like, yeah, that's not what you need. You have a different disagreement. That's not what the problem is. So when is it requesting an IEE a waste of time? Is if you don't disagree with the psych report, like you actually think the psych report was fine, but you don't agree with what the school is offering, right? An IEE isn't going to necessarily change their offer of FAPE. It's just getting another opinion on the assessment and the present levels. So if you don't disagree on present levels, that's a long time to wait for probably no change. Districts and schools don't need to change anything about their offer of FAPE as a result of an IEE. All they need to do is consider the results of the IEE. And so this is also if you have an assessor who, an outside assessor, an IEE assessor who doesn't do as thorough an assessment, who isn't credentialed as a school psychologist, who didn't do classroom observations, things like that, that district is going to consider that assessment and look at it and go, this probably isn't competent enough for us to do anything with. And then you'll be in exactly the same position. I've had a lot of parents request IEEs and be like, oh, I don't disagree with your psych report. I think you totally covered it. I want them to have this placement. That's an IEE is not going to do that, right? And the other time when it can be a waste of time, when it's not useful, is when there's really not a documented significant educational impact. So if a kid is at or near grade level without pretty significant intervention already happening, a second opinion isn't likely to show enough of that educational impact, right? So in that wrong disagreement piece, in that case, if you have a disagreement with the placement, but not the report, then actually what you need to be looking at are what are the goals, right? Because it's present levels to drive goals, goals drive services, and then placement is derived from where is the environment that those services can be delivered in, right? And so if you have an issue with placement, it's more useful to go backward into, um, what are the services being offered, and if I feel like, are those enough services for my kid? Those types of things, then that really should be based in, well, actually, I think this kid needs more goals in these areas, or this area of present levels wasn't addressed. And that's going to be a much more effective way to get what you're looking for than a second opinion that only needs to be considered and may say exactly the same thing as the first opinion, and then you'll be in exactly the same position. All right. So, I do independent educational evaluations. I don't always talk people out of them, despite what I might say. Um, and I do, kind of enjoy doing that. I think that's those cases are always really fun for me. So I will share all of this so that you know how to contact me